Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm broadcasting live from the lab, which is on the stolen land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. And so we'd like to give our respect to the many Indigenous people who have stewarded this land for generations and to say thanks. I just wanted to give a few notes on what the lab does. We are a small experimental art space in San Francisco. We have given over $710,000 over the past 4 or 5 years to many, many different artists in the Bay Area and elsewhere to try to sustain their life right now and to try to make sure that we can create a semblance of a space in which experimental ideas and thinking can live and thrive. So not only do we give funding to artists, but we also give them the license to completely and totally reconfigure our operating model. So we give them keys to the space, the login for our website, and we give them the directive to try to make institutions as a platform work better for the empowerment and the creation of art projects. We at least attempt to do that. Of course, we don't always succeed, but the hope is to really try to make as many artists allow us to do better work for them. So during the pandemic, of course, we can't do what we normally do, which is gather a lot of people in space to kind of co-present and co-participate in the project of making art come to exist. And so we are trying to do something similar on Zoom, which is a rather stilted kind of periphery of that. But I really I have been enjoying these forum sessions, and they're really more proposals to different artists and activists to kind of see how they'd remanage our world given the circumstances we live in. And we've had everyone from deep lifetime activists to long-term artists, to thinkers, to academics, to poets. So we really try to range the kind of imaginative spectrum between a lot of different people. So these are really proposals to you, the audience, to try to talk back to us and try to kind of create this imaginative space between our weird little virtual hemispheres here. So please help us do that by using the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Once the panelists and everybody has had a chance to speak, we will definitely be fielding questions. We would like those questions to be as incisive and exciting as possible. So please try to participate if you can, because the conversation I believe is really exciting and valid, especially in this case. So I just want to let you know that the lab can offer real-time language translation, live closed captioning, sign language translation during every talk. We just ask that you request that in advance because we're a very small operation. So please reach out to us at the labsf@thelab.org so we can make arrangements. But for now, we'll put a link in the chat to a transcription service that you can use online. Firstly and foremostly, this event is co-presented by our wonderful colleagues at Pro Arts Gallery and Commons in Oakland, which is an extraordinary organization who commissioned Terrain, this publication, and we just want to give our thanks for them for existing and for persisting in spite of everything. And so thanks to them and the collective of artists and organizers who make pro arts happen. So each of these artists, designers, journalists, thinkers, panelists tonight represent for me personally what imaginative resistance looks like. And this is really important because the collective commitment of each of the people on screen right now inspires me to do what I do at the lab entirely. And I think of all this work as part of an ecosystem, as part of a collective ecosystem. And even though it seems like it's gathered by hierarchies a lot of the time, in these smaller art spaces, it really is a collective thinking process. So I want to give tribute to each of you for making that happen and doing the work that you do, because you make my work happen in many ways. So I'm going to be just handing it over to Sam Lefebvre, who will be moderating moderating the discussion tonight and basically facilitated the entire publication and edited it. It is gorgeous. So excited to get my copy. And so I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Sam. Thank you, everyone, for showing up tonight. I appreciate you. Bye.
Hey, yeah, thank you so much, Dina. Thanks to the lab. I've really enjoyed the forum program this past year, and I'm really glad to be a part of it. And yeah, thanks to ProArts for publishing Terrain, and to all the contributors and the co-panelists here. I'm Sam Lefebvre. I edited Terrain. I kind of coordinated it as through sort of a writer residency with ProArts. And I want to say a little bit about what the publication is about by way of describing some of the conditions that led to its creation. And to do that, I kind of want to go back to the mid-90s. Okay. So in the mid-90s, the city of Oakland tore down the Party Wetmore building, which was next to Oakland City Hall. And the Party Wetmore building was full of bookstores and artist studios for decades. Basically, the tenants protested, and as a sort of consolation, the city created the Oakland Art Gallery on the other side of Frank Ogawa or Oscar Grant Plaza, and promised the Oakland Art Gallery free rent. So eventually ProArts moved into the Oakland Art Gallery space, and the free rent deal lapsed. So at the same time, the city actually reduced ProArts funding through the cultural funding program. So this is the city kind of clawing back a consolation prize. And I think it's an interesting example of public disinvestment in the arts. And I think it kind of mirrors, a much broader, more dramatic retreat. The city's much broader, more dramatic retreat from kind of directly providing social services. And in response, ProArts has been kind of cavalier. Early last year, the gallery answered the call for a nationwide rent strike, and Terrain is one of the projects funded with money withheld from the city. So ProArts in this way is kind of an example of what Terrain is about. Artists and arts organizations responding to the many crises of this past year in a principled political manner. Of course, this past year, we also had a public health crisis in the form of an airborne pandemic. We had an environmental crisis. I think everyone in the Bay Area will not forget the day, wildfire smoke blotted out the sun, right? And we had an economic crisis, of course, housing insecurity, food insecurity, widespread unemployment. That kind of, we had this interesting category of essential worker kind of surfacing the labor that brings objects close enough for us to touch and breathe on. And we had, a government stimulus that was really sufficient only to kind of maintain the current social order, right? Beginning in the summer, of course, we also had an insurrection nationwide spurred by the police killing of George Floyd. We saw very militant tactics in the streets, attacking police stations, redistributing goods. There was also a violent far-right counterinsurgency. And basically, artists locally in Oakland who, artists I admired, reacted to all of this, not only by making work that kind of addresses the moment, but also with a sort of recommitment to collective care and collective struggle. So, we had a debate around this question of a radical mutual aid practice. We had debate around theories of change, for example, defunding versus abolishing the police. And I think all of this kind of seemed to continue, shifting the idea of a political artist. So a political artist is not necessarily one who makes political work, but maybe one who's a part of political organizations or political projects. And not only in, the capacity of a storyteller or an illustrator or a propagandist, but in any kind of strategically useful capacity, right? Another way to say this is arts activism is not sort of, contained within the arts sphere. It's arts activism is abolition, it is class struggle, it is anti-fascist and anti-white supremacist direct action. And I don't want to forget that, art, of course, can obscure the contradictions of capitalism. One of my pieces in Terrain is about the Downtown Oakland murals. kind of argue that they were used by landlords to, intervene in the kind of ostensibly grassroots cultural production related to the uprising, and sort of, help landlords kind of detach the issue of policing from property and business interests. So this is all to say that Terrain came out of my desire to hear from artists, examining their creative and political practices, specifically ones who are really active in and around downtown Oakland. So that's my kind of preamble. And right now we're going to do kind of a go around hearing from everyone about their pieces. And then we'll do another go around with everyone kind of responding to everyone else, or asking questions, or commenting on the publication overall. And with what time remains, we'll do kind of an open discussion. And of course, then there'll be the audience questions. So thanks again, everyone. Really glad to have you here. Everyone here wrote incredible pieces for Terrain. I'm excited to talk tonight. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Alex Cruse.
Great, thank you, Sam. And thanks everybody for your contributions, and to Dina for hosting. Yeah, it's such an honor to be included in a publication that was funded by a rent strike. That's, really great. So as Sam said, my name is Alex Cruse, and I am dialing in from stolen Chochenyo Ohlone land, aka Oakland. And my essay for Terrain is entitled Towards a Back Loop at the End of the World. And it sort of attempts to turn a listening ear to the interactions between systems, be they economic or political or ecological or technological, beginning with this very abject herb garden plot established by the Oakland Police Department outside their administration building on Broadway. So my practice is really concerned with spatial organization of cities and the connective tissues therein that produce different political subjectivities. And I could talk around the essay, but I wanted to maybe just read a couple of selections from it. It's a short piece, but it's broken up over a period of days where I was just recording some reflections over this past summer, 2020. So I'm just going to read those in chronological order. And the first excerpt is from December 1st, 2020, and then it sort of moves backward. Okay, December 1st, 2020. The adaptive cycle is the primary model used by resilience ecologists to explain the 4 phases of life which all organisms and natural systems experience. This cycle contains 2 loops, front and back. The front loop refers to early rapid growth and a capturing of energy that culminates in stability, persistence, and rigidity. These stable, though impermanent, states may recede into a back loop if exposed to disturbance, whether stochastic or ordered and gradual. In her 2020 book, Anthropocene Backloop, Experimentation in Unsafe Operating Space, Stephanie Wakefield imports the heuristic of the back loop as a provocation for our contemporary moment. As she writes in the first chapter, a back loop is a time of confusion and collapse, as well as potential and reorganization. By rejecting a doomsday Anthropocene discourse which limbs our front loop disasters, Wakefield instead points us towards an alternative reading of large-scale experimentation as modus operandi. Rather, a fate or a crisis happening to us, she writes, to inhabit the back loop in this way is to dwell in and populate it, to take hold of and perhaps even take over as one does a host. Okay. And the next segment is from July 20th, 2020. There are 2 entries on this day. This is the first of 2. One day this past summer, during one of many aimless hours-long walks in a city wavering across different stages of lockdown, I took note of a 15 by 6 foot plot at the edge of the PAB, Police Authority Administration Building property, a mid-century modernist slab filled with depleted earth, punctuated with popsicle sticks, on which were printed in even script, feverfew and sacred white sage, among others. These markers, ironically, denoted only different types of absences. The Oakland Police Department's failed herb garden stands synecdochally for the axiomatic truth of pigs' collective inability to nourish anything which sustains or protects life. Another black box, its outputs unknown. Only a few weeks later, a spectacular lightning storm initiated a series of wildfires throughout California, blocking out the sun for many consecutive days. Everything, all growth, appeared suspended in the amber light. The front loop refuses to hold. And lastly, this entry is taken from, it's taken from June 21st, 2020, the day of the solstice. In Dark Matters, a landmark text on the co-constitutive relationship between Blackness and surveillance, Simone Brown considers Edouard Glissant's conceptions of visibility and opacity alongside what she terms Black luminosity. Here, Brown sketches a causal relationship between technological and epistemological paradigms, citing 18th century lantern laws, which forbade Black individuals from walking in the city at night without either some form of illumination or a white companion. These laws, she explains, help delineate a matrix of militarized public space as they instrumentalize ideas about security and belonging within burgeoning urbanity. In situating lantern laws as a supervisory device that sought to render those who could be or were always and already criminalized by this legal framework as outside of the category of the human and as unvisible, my intent is not to reify Western notions of the human, but to say here that the candle lantern as a form of knowledge production about the Black, Indigenous, and mixed race subject was part of the project of a racializing surveillance. And that's taken from Dark Matters. For Brown, luminosity is not simply a physical property, but a site of ontological decryption at the hand of the sovereign. So in thinking about the sort of deletion or the obscuring of the sun over those days across the city, I was trying to just draw these parallels between obscurity and how that manifests in the political sphere. But yeah, I think that's it from me for now. Sorry, who's speaking next, Sam?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alex.
Thank you.
Yeah, so next would be Dio.
Great. Hello. My name's Dio Brooks, they, them pronouns. Thanks to Sam and to Alex and Dina for speaking so far. Thanks to the lab and to Pearl Arts for hosting this event. It's been really great to work on terrain with all of the folks involved. I'm really excited for people to see it and have physical copies in hand. And as a contributor, I didn't actually write a piece for Terrain. I am one of 3 people who have functioned as sort of publisher printers for the physical copies of the document. So me and my friends June and Mollie Underwood are the people who have been printing the copies of it on a Riso GR3750 machine. And I come from a background of printmaking and sort of independent publishing. I have spent most of the last 2 years since I moved to Oakland producing zines and generally doing like things at the intersection of philosophy, social commentary, art, and small batch print publication. So it's been really fun to work on Terrain. It's one of the largest Riso printed projects that I think I know of to date, which has been very exciting. And it's really interesting to be able to use, again, as Alex said, like money that came from a rent strike to be able to fund this publication, which is in sort of an esoteric format for art and for print matter, and something that is very much a passion project, I think, of all of the people who came up with it and who have worked on it. I guess I would like to talk a little bit about just like the format of Riso printing as a choice. Riso is like an old-timey machine. They were mostly they're still being produced, but it's something that was more common to see as like a photocopier that could be used to make flyers or leaflets from the 80s to the early 2000s. They're a Japanese machine that uses soy-based inks, and it's kind of like screen printing. So if you can imagine like a book that had been screen printed, the final copies of Terrain will look very similar to that. And we all just thought that the look and feel of this technology really lends itself to sort of the ethos behind the publication, which is that of, first of all, attempting to have a conversation about the commercialization of certain types of art, especially at the intersection of politics and of people who produce art that is inextricable from their own politics. I find myself, and I think a lot of other printmakers in that position, given that the materials we use and the work we do is sort of in and of itself doesn't lend itself to super commercialized work, and unless you're talking about like really specific types of both printing and journalism. So yeah, it's just been a really exciting project to sort of push that medium to what may or may not be its logical extent, and try to figure out the ways that we can like let the medium and the material add some sense of context or sense of place to the words and the information and the images that are being presented. And for me, it's also, there's a form of like archival that is really needed in terms of political movements and the sort of ephemera of art that gets produced within those situations. And so it's really nice to have this sort of a document that feels somewhat alive with the context of when and how it was created and the sentiments behind it. Yeah, I think that's all I have for now. But thank you all so much.
Julian?
That's my name. You can call me that in third person too. Yeah, thanks to everyone for being here tonight, the audience. Thanks for my co-contributors, Sam, Dina, ProArts, the lab. Thanks everyone. So yeah, I've prepared an excerpt of about a third of my piece in Terrain. The piece is called Catastrophic Everyday Confrontational Mutual Aid. And it's mostly just the theoretical bits. So, when you actually read it, maybe you'll be a little more entertained, a little less bored. But before I read the piece, do you want to make a general comment underscoring what ends up as a small point in the piece? So it's become common for some socialist critics to argue that mutual aid projects don't meaningfully contribute to building social movements and social movement organizations. This argument, I think, fails to acknowledge how deeply mutual aid is integrated in organizing efforts, such as those I'm most familiar with by autonomous tenant unions. And these critics usually don't give enough credit to many of those who participate in mutual aid, who I think, as a lot of the folks here kind of can put on display, who are well aware of the pitfalls that critics raise, and are they're doing their best to avoid those. The other kind of comment is, on this front, is that in a lot of ways, the debate kind of ends up being a front for two other older debates that I kind of see as debates between and among anarchists and socialists. On the one hand, about the state, reform, revolution, and on the other, questions of informal versus formal organization. And for that reason, I think we're likely to kind of continue seeing this kind of criticism and criticism of mutual aid, and it's just, we're probably going to hear it periodically when there's upsurges of mutual aid. And I think that the best attitude that we can adopt is, on the one hand, for people who do take a critical attitude, to encourage them to actually join and contribute to mutual aid projects, so that what they have to offer can actually be put to work, and that mutual aid practitioners can listen to what's useful in criticism and ignore what they don't find useful. So now the excerpt. Every need people have is social, and the phrase that Marxist feminists give for how social needs are met over time is social reproduction. Racial capitalism is such that in the course of doing what's essential to socially reproduce in unpaid care work and waged work, the exploited and oppressed are not only forced to reproduce the lives and livelihoods of exploiters and oppressors, they also depend on and deepen social competition, separation, and violence among each other. But most of all, and despite everything, people socially reproduce by supporting one another. The concept of mutual aid was proposed by Peter Kropotkin to describe common practices of solidarity, cooperation, fellowship, and sharing among all species. Over the course of the 20th century, mutual aid came more often to refer not to common acts of social reproductive solidarity, but to unique projects which one way or another push cooperation, fellowship, and sharing directly against racial capitalist competition, separation, and violence. Practitioners and intellectuals came to distinguish this mutual aid from forms of solidarity that don't challenge exploitation and oppression, calling those charity. Dean Spade argues that successful mutual aid projects are distinct from charity in three ways: by developing participants' critical understanding of racial capitalism, by mobilizing and expanding social movements, and by encouraging broader participation in providing aid, especially from those receiving aid, rather than relying on only a few specialists. Police and prison abolitionists, as well as anarchists, anti-state communists, and revolutionary socialists, have also criticized government welfare programs for not only, like charity, drawing dividing lines between the deserving and undeserving poor, but also excluding undocumented people while subjecting disproportionately Black welfare recipients to heightened surveillance and criminal punishment. Left critics of mutual aid doubt the extent that particular projects or the general practice successfully differentiates itself from charity, occasionally even arguing mutual aid should be abandoned when it amounts to charity by another name. Many mutual aid practitioners agree with the concerns of critics, while many others are, despite intentions otherwise, co-opted into becoming charity projects as they increasingly focus on enabling social reproduction, but not developing social critique, or not expanding connections to social movements, or not encouraging newcomers to participate in collective control. What I offer briefly to a critical theory of mutual aid is a vocabulary to differentiate between types of mutual aid, so projects can be effectively compared. Much writing on mutual aid observes that emergencies often catalyze. At the same time, social movement participants are familiar with the truth that mutual aid projects proliferate in the least exceptional times due to the ever-presence of emergency conditions among the oppressed. These 2 points indicate the first two types of mutual aid projects, namely catastrophic mutual aid and everyday mutual aid. To these first two, I think there's a third type rooted in supporting confrontational mass direct actions, but providing these things like emergency medical care and self-defense tools and training. I call these types of projects confrontational mutual aid. And that's the excerpt.
Cool, right on. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Yeah, so now we're gonna kind of go, do a go around. I think we'll probably go in the same order. And oh, actually, hey Tara, I cannot wait to hear from you. Please go on.
Hey, no worries. I was like, oh, all right, that's fine. First of all, hi, I'm Tara, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm tuning in from Oakland, which is on Lishan Ohlone territory. And I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of ways that we can materially acknowledge the land that we're on, including donating to, or not even donating, but sorry, providing our land tax to the Segurite Land Trust is one way of showing our solidarity with Indigenous peoples. That said, I'm here representing Moments Cooperative and Community Space. We collectively contributed a piece to Terrain, and thank you to Sam for inviting us. And it's been really nice to hear from the other contributors, including Dio, big fan of Rizo over at Moments. So it was good to hear you talk about that. But yeah, so Moments was founded in the summer of 2020, so very much like in the midst of what Terrain kind of centers. And we collectively decided to take over a storefront in downtown Oakland that we had all previously worked at. And so, yeah, that was when we started, and we've spent the last few months renovating it from top to bottom, every aspect of it, the floors, repainting the walls, knocking out walls, like just everything. And so, yeah, we actually just opened in January for curbside pickup. And we now have a town fridge, which comes up in terrain several times. And so we definitely are trying to now bring a lot of our dreams of mutual aid projects to fruition into 2021. And so with that said, our contribution to terrain was pretty short. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and read it. And yeah, like I said, we collectively wrote this, myself and the 3 other members of Moments Cooperative, and made no distinctions between where one person's thoughts ended and another person's began, in an effort to really just like collectively represent what we all together stand for. So this is called When the Walls Are Torn Down. We paint over the grime left behind. We scrape away empty words. We tear up the floorboards to reveal the rot and dust beneath, hidden but corrosive all the same, warping even concrete. It's toxic to our lungs. But the toxic must be set loose before it can be set free. That which is swept under the rug remains in the room. Our lungs were built for cleansing. There's glitter there too, and the rivulets that carve up the cement are like water. We want to say that even in a time of disaster, there is room for beauty. But that suggests that for us, there is ever a time that is not disaster, which is to say that all we know is apocalypse and beauty. We know how to live in the ruins because we always have known how to stretch scraps into feasts. There is no room for scarcity here. Why here, why now? We do not always get to choose when the door opens. Often someone has to give up space in order for us to take up space. But when that space arrives, we are ready, we realize, because these dreams have been percolating, waiting quietly on a shelf in a closet in our head like a friendly ghost. Holding on to physical space and carving out space for Black and Indigenous people of color and queer and trans people of color is always needed, no matter the point in time. In a pandemic where BIPOC and QTPOC are most negatively impacted and hurt, holding on to space that is specifically created for us is beyond necessary. The present systems in place are not meant to support us. When we look out for one another, we create a transcending interpersonal relationship that passes on to generations above and after us. We help heal what was wounded. We begin to understand the conditions for the wound. Understanding and acknowledging one another's experiences, knowing the implicit differences across our lives, and finding the ways to bridge ourselves to one another or towards where we would like to see each other go. We see that we are intrinsically tied to the evils of capitalism and colonialism when we examine the foundational aspects of our lived experience, the experiences of those we know and love, and especially those we do not know how to relate to. During a pandemic, these similarities and differences are transparent. However, how we choose to respond and what we provide for one another is what allows us to meet in compassion. How would you define safety if the walls were torn down and the gentrified luxury condos fell into the bay? No cops allowed in this space. No politicians allowed in this space. No trans misogynist, white supremacist, ableists in this space. We dream of community care and redistribution. We dream of access to fresh food, a town fridge, anarchist zine library, printing for all. We dream of knowledge sharing that is actively anti-racist and anti-institutional. We dream of land back, echoing the demands of Indigenous Black comrades. What does community care look like? Community care is the death of gatekeepers. If capitalism is individualism, then community care is the only antidote. To reject scarcity is to share your last crumb, knowing it will be easier to find more to eat when both of your bellies are full. Community care is the rejection of self-care as commodity sold by Urban Outfitters. Community care is a denial of scalability, of efficiency. It is moving at the pace of the slowest among us so we can arrive at the peak together and share the view. We don't reward militance that denies our humanity. We want no part in a revolution that doesn't value rest. Making a community space is our collective artwork. We are embodying this future for us when we tear apart a space that was never ours. Art and action are one. Our art is our action is our art. The pandemics of capitalism and white supremacy are constant. It is always the right time to center our people. Walking side by side along Broadway, the trans ancestors hear our chants, our calls, our tears, giddy screams when the walls are torn down. They urge us to continue. This pandemic has shifted time, just enough of a pause in the system for an uprising. Thank you.
Wow, yeah, thanks so much for that. Yeah, that's an amazing piece. I was so thrilled when you first submitted it, and it reads so well, looks fantastic on the page, and it sounds incredible out loud. So thanks for that reading. Yeah, so now we're gonna kind of do another go around where we're a little more sort of remarking upon or responding to each other's pieces or the publication at whole, or raising questions for one another, and then we'll go into kind of more of an open discussion. And to kind of start that off, I was struck particularly in this reading of the Moments piece by the kind of attack on individualism, and calling ego death kind of a prerequisite to be against or outside of capitalism. Yeah, I was interested to read that part when it first came in, because I was working on an introduction essay, and I was similarly thinking about individualism and the way it's sort of structurally like encouraged in the arts, sort of by virtue of the way that art in very clear ways, artists tend to work as independent contractors, and I think that that sort of ends up becoming a sort of barrier to building solidarity or collective power, or sort of like recognizing common interests. And and I think that the arts kind of piloting or trying out like the sort of independent contractor like gig work model is really interesting, because I think increasingly, working class existence in the United States looks more and more like that, especially with the rise of the so-called kind of gig economy. So I guess, that's a comment, and I guess one question for you about it would be, how is this form of capitalist individualism kind of valorized in the arts? I wonder if the collective kind of having conversation around that. So that's something to maybe come back to after this go around. I don't know. So I'll just kind of hand it off from there, and I think we can go in the same order, starting with Alex.
Yeah, I don't know. Could you come back to me maybe? I don't. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, Dio, perhaps?
Hello. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I have been thinking a lot in the process of printing how there is sort of it's interesting, like the term ego death is especially funny to me, because anyone who's ever operated not just Rezo machines but like most printmaking methods that aren't like a large format digital printer knows that there's an element of sort of chaos within using these machines to like get them to produce the object that you want. And for me as like an artist, as a printmaker, I'm really concerned with like the physical object of the book that I'm making. And I think for terrain, for the subject matter, and again, like the sort of timing, context, place of all of the pieces that are contained within it, it's so fascinating to me that the choice is the option rather that's available to us is that if we wanted something where there was like a non-commercial printing being used, we end up having to create this essentially like collectivized network of like the three of us, me, June, and Mollie, in order to navigate and operate access to these couple of machines that just live in some spaces in Oakland that, especially since the pandemic, are pretty underutilized. And it's something that you have to have like a sense of release about. Like, you're not ever going to get the exact outcome of the project you want, but the impetus to create the thing in the first place and to sit down with that technology and sort of retrofit what is in your mind to what's possible using, that specific printer. It reminds me of sort of the underlying concept behind a lot of collective spaces that center mutual aid. It feels like a very similar practice to me. And also, having come to the practices of printmaking from a very DIY ethos, and having like people who are tied up in each other's needs and struggle and ability to access the means to like articulate those things, it just feels like a really perfect marriage, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I felt that especially with the Moments piece, but I think also Alex's piece, I don't know, there's like a certain way of abstracting the physical sense of being in downtown Oakland, for example, and reproducing that in the words that we're using, or in like the colors, or the tactile, like physical object. I think there's something really beautiful in that, and it's been really fun to try to like make that exist.
Right on. Yeah, I think we can just kind of maybe move into more of the open discussion period, but maybe I'll pass it to Julian at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think just a couple of connections I'm thinking about between this sort of question of individualism and some of the points around the kind of that Dio was just making in terms of like sort of cobbled together flexible collectivities. And I think also one of the points that shows up in the Moments piece that was read is kind of having to relinquish from kind of like the question of scalability, or like what's efficient, or what we would do to like just like make the product the quickest way that would work the best for a certain individual. I feel like and then to kind of connect that back into some of the stuff that ends up getting talked about around mutual aid. I think that's that mutual aid is not scalable is like a very common criticism that people make. And I think what we kind of find, and that I think what some of the folks here tonight have kind of indicated is just being in collectivity, prioritizing community and care for each other, means kind of paying attention to something kind of completely different, and that really has nothing to do with what might be most effective for either profit or for an individual. And yeah, I mean, I think going back to the scene of the neglected herb garden that is run by the police. I mean, you can only imagine, like, in a way, the herb garden is kind of a nice metaphor for this kind of cobbled together collective practice, right, that is completely neglected and really has no use for the police, so they kind of just abandoned it. But it's still that kind of potential that's there if someone else were to make use of it.
Yeah, totally. I don't know, Alex, if you want to chime in, or.
Yeah, I actually had a question, Tara, if you want to say more about the line, "Our lungs were built for cleansing." I really love that line, and I noted it in first reading and then as in your excerpt just now, and thinking about the mutual air pieces that appear later in Terrain. And I don't know, like if you want to maybe unpack that metaphor a little bit, or just thinking about an individual lung kind of entering into these interconnected systems, like where we're all sharing this polluted air, and how that has a sort of a political register.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks everybody for everything that's been said so far. But yeah, I think, I mean, that line is like rooted in a reality and not just in a metaphor, in the sense that, like, while working on the creation of moment space, like, we had to deal with literally like dust particles flying up from underneath the floorboards, and just like sanding everything down, and just like probably unleashing asbestos and who knows what, like, you know, just like the kind of toxic chemicals that come with like renovating an old building. And then of course there's like literally this airborne pandemic that we're all wearing masks for, while trying to wear masks that also keep out keep out the dust particles. And then there was also the, like, you know, as it comes up in your piece, like there was the wildfires. There was a time where we actually just had to fully stop our renovations because the air was filled with smoke. And so sometimes it felt like we are out here and we literally like cannot breathe the air that is outside. But at the same time, you know, our lungs are part of this process in the same way that, you know, like your piece touches on kind of like ecosystems in this way, where like trees are a part of this process. Like everything that we are like interconnected with is part of this process of taking in oxygen and releasing CO2, and back and forth and back and forth. And our, you know, one thing that I was thinking about, you know, that we talked about, but like that kind of comes up with the lungs and with our bodies, is that they are meant to like take in some of this toxic stuff and filter it out so that you can then still exist and still breathe. So even amidst these like toxic conditions, we still can get what we need. And so that was kind of the thinking behind that line. So thank you for your question. But yeah, to kind of jump off of your piece, I was really interested in your piece because it reminded me actually a lot of The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Lowenhaupt Singh, because she talks a lot about what she calls like shifting assemblages. And you particularly said in your piece, where's the line? Something to the effect of there's no collective we or our, no our, no singular we, which reminded me a lot of how, Singh talks about how we can't expect, some of our needs are actually mutually exclusive, but that doesn't prevent us from being in coalition on the things that we are aligned with. And that's something that she kind of uses as a central frame. And something that, I think is important to realize as we're operating. And also it reminded me of, back to Julian's point of bringing up scalability and how we touch on scalability. In Mushroom at the End of the World, she's extremely, not anti-scalability, but like talks about scalability not being like a feature of nature, and that nature by necessity has these individual ecosystems that function all on the same planet, but not nothing should be scalable. It would dominate the world. Like a virus is scalable, and invasive species can be scalable, but scalability should not be a prerequisite for success. So I appreciated that coming up in Julian's piece as well. So.
Totally, yeah. Thanks, everyone. I guess I kind of want to hear a little more from Dio and just share just really briefly that, I first contacted Dio's collaborator, June, around designing the publication. And I became familiar with June's work through a tenant union that we belong with. And I was like, oh, I'm into this design. I learned a little bit about that it was being risograph printed and this kind of thing. And I guess I was sort of pleased to make this connection in more of an organizing context, and that seemed kind of remarkable to me. And then June brought in Dio, and they're of course working with Mollie, as mentioned. And I kind of want to hear a little more from Dio about where the printing process is at, like right now, since we have the opportunity. I don't know. I'm just wondering, like, what's the most recent spread that came off of the press. And I don't know if you want to mention the kind of printer conversation insert thing too, but.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Where are we now? We're, I would say, over 2/3 of the way finished with printing, which doesn't include the phases of cutting, collating, and binding. So I don't know in terms of like actual percent done where that is, but we're somewhere. We're feeling really good about it. There is sort of a curse that comes along with the machines we use, where there are days where you go to print and you just don't get to, and we haven't been having those days. I'm knocking on wood as I say that, so that's nice. Yeah, there are a couple of really interesting things that we got to do that are like calling on techniques I learned as far back as, God, 10 years ago, like starting out in school in printmaking as an undergraduate. There's this really beautiful photo spread that is printed that everyone just oohed and awed and stared at for a very long time after it was complete. And there's just a lot of really nice opportunity. It is rare, as someone who does either graphic design or printing, to get an opportunity to produce something from start to finish. Most people who do either like any part of the printing and designing process, either for fun or for their work, it tends to be very specialized. And so it's like it's a big project, but in a fun way, to be able to do things like tweaking the layout and format of pages. There are a couple of really beautiful like photo edits in there. And in general, we're just like excited about making all of the pages look as good as they can. And then once the binding happens, I think there will be an amount of experimentation, at least there will be for me, with sort of the scrap parts, like the weird pieces that are left over. That's always one of the most fun parts of printing. And yeah, I guess the main thing that sort of spurred me and June, before connecting with Mollie through you, Sam, to work on this is both of our background in doing like printmaking as a form of mutual aid. Both June and I, from before we met, have had a lot of experiences sending printed material to incarcerated comrades and to people who do mutual aid for those people who do jail support. And I've been printing zines and various like political literature for as long as I can remember, and handing them out to info shops or tabling at events and stuff like that. And so again, to go back to this question of scalability from the printmaking perspective, it's really interesting that this sort of subversive almost methodology for reproducing literature, that it sometimes can even be considered, like reproducing zines is something that is in a gray area copyright wise, sometimes in the ways that people do it. And being able to take that and scale it up, but at the same time acknowledging that there is a limitation to the that there's a limitation to the medium, and in that we can like push it up until a certain point and then we just have to stop because there's no way that you can make 1,000 copies of something on a reso. It feels aligned with our inability to scale things like jail support or the kinds of like community-based mutual aid that we're both very, very interested in and invested in. It feels totally fine that we can't make 1,000 of them. It feels better for 300 people to have it in their hand and to be able to understand this like really specific sense of time and place again that they're made in. And it's important for us to also make these kind of artistic and very technical, but fundamentally simple processes sort of legible and available to more people who may not think of themselves as artists, because everyone has the ability to make art, right? And so much of what gives this like sheen of sort of credibility, especially within the more like well-funded arts arena, a lot of those processes can be broken down and repurposed and refigured out of materials that are already there. And that to me feels like it is very much at the heart of everything that people are doing in terms of attempting to care for our communities with essentially the leftover scraps of a world that is crumbling in on itself.
Yeah, totally. So on this point of the kind of flexibility and lack of scale, I mean, it reminds me of another point made in the Moments piece, which is about kind of impermanence. I think it's that the collective says something to the effect of, when the moment no longer calls for this project, we will disperse. And I wonder if Tara, if you want to say a little more about that and maybe how it connects to what you call in the piece, I think, the nonprofit industrial complex. And because, so yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. We talk about impermanence, and I actually want to like bring it to something that I noticed you talking about in one of your pieces, which was anonymity and collective authorship as a means of like avoiding appropriation, and then also assuming erasure and shifting with your surroundings. And I thought that was interesting that it came up in your writing, because it's something that's obviously very central to our collective values at Moments. But it kind of comes from, I think all of us that work in the art scene or participate in the art scene in various ways, like have had to interact with institutions, nonprofit institutions often, especially in the Bay Area. And I think that what I've personally witnessed and what I think we've all witnessed is that there's these institutions that, were started by like a group of scrappy artists at a certain point in time to create a space for their community and like hold that space. And, as this like gets touched on in, your piece and Julian's piece, like across the board, like the more legitimized and the more like supported and structurally stable these institutions become, the less radical they are as they become like beholden to board interests and to funding from foundations and all of these things. And slowly and surely, like the people who started the organization, they leave, they move on, they no longer are living in the city because they can't afford to live in the city or the town, like they're gone, and they get replaced until you have this completely, really new organization under the same name that is now not serving its original purpose, disconnected entirely from its original purpose, and now just trying to sustain its own existence for the sake of its existence. And I like, that's what I see as part of the nonprofit industrial complex. In addition to like what you point out about how it becomes like essentially like a reputation laundering for, the arms dealers of the world and whatever. But yeah, I think Moments specifically, like we arose in this moment, particularly in the midst of the summer uprisings, when we felt like our location is very central to downtown Oakland. It is literally like a block away from Oscar Grant Plaza. And we felt that even when we weren't open as Moments, like we could be a station where we could provide safety if there's tear gas or water bottles or protester kits or whatever. And that's what we were doing before Wolfman closed. And so Moments wanted to make sure that this space still existed for the people that were, in the uprisings and for, and marching in the streets. And that's a very real need. And, a space for queer and trans, like people of color, in downtown Oakland is a very real need in this moment, but we don't want to become too attached to this like concept of ourselves. We just want to serve this need that actually exists in downtown Oakland at this time, and avoid this, institutionalization.
Yeah, I really appreciate how these projects kind of their relationships with anonymity or the obscuring of the self, it kind of is an antithesis to this new reality that, again, not to make generalizations, not to suggest that the pandemic or its effects are universally felt at all, but that, like we all have our names displayed prominently in these little individuated boxes, and we can see where each other is, where we are, and like when we're online, for example. And so to have that kind of like sublimation of personal identity, just very materially felt in the printing process, like you were describing, Dio, or like with the Moments Collective. I don't know, I just felt like those were very powerful interventions into these new uncomfortable paradigms.
Totally. I don't know. Should we go to audience questions? I see they've begun to come in, and I encourage people watching to send more. I don't time check. I don't know. I forget when this is, how long it's supposed to go. But I think there's one question here that is, I think all of us could probably speak to one way or another. So I'll throw it out there. Anonymous attendee asks, what was it like collaborating on something like this in a time of such isolation? Good lessons learned? Any good lessons learned, they say? So yeah, I think obviously this past year has been, intensely alienating from each other. We're sort of re-atomized. Even in, I tend to come together in collective settings now, like on Zoom, and obviously it's this pale impression, this mere like semblance of connectedness, right? And it's so heavily mediated by this thing. So it's been a real challenge. But yeah, so I'll read this question again, and then anyone can pick it up. Oops, where'd it go? Yeah, what was it like collaborating on something like this in a time of such isolation? Any good lessons learned?
I'll talk. I guess the main thing this made me think of is I think one of the reasons even that we ended up with the publication as it is physically is that early in the pandemic, one of the only spaces or activities that I and June both had access to was our print shop. Being off of work for about 6-7 months before I eventually started working again, and not having anything to do while there's like a swell of the pandemic and the uprising and all of this like thought and synthesis and conversation that's sort of bottled up like within everyone, coming to a head in the form of, literally just not having anything else to do but go like try to make the Rezo printer work for 7 hours because it's one of the only buildings I can go be inside of. I definitely want to count that as like part of the medium of the thing. I think isolation has, for at least for us, been a component of how the thing has come to be at all.
Yeah, thanks, Dio. That's great. I think the way I would respond to that question is that I actually don't feel as a writer that I'm ever working in isolation. I feel that even if we are physically distanced or physically isolated, that I'm always keeping thoughts of the other contributors or of the people like to whom I'm responding or in conversation with, or being in conversation with the land or history. Like I just feel like those the interconnectedness kind of sustains me, at least existentially, throughout the process, the creative process. But yeah, that's how I view it.
I definitely identify with that last comment, Alex. I think the place where I kind of felt isolation around the piece was sort of more to do with like space or rather time rather than connectivity. Like I think just my world had gotten pretty small for quite a long time. And I wasn't aware of a lot of the mutual aid projects that I ended up writing about that, had these bigger moments over the summer. And, I at the time, I wasn't able to be out in a lot of what was going on over the summer, just in terms of like needing to be extra careful to keep folks at home safe. So, I wasn't aware of a lot of the stuff that happened. Then kind of I think the sense of isolation was kind of like, wow, there's all of these amazing things that like were going on like months ago, and now I'm kind of like interacting with them like in the way that they've left records on, you know, various feeds. And so I think there was this kind of, there's definitely like was a strong sense of like interconnectivity and like marveling at the like opportunity to get to like write about and engage with the amazing like mutual aid work that folks had done. But it was also like, you know, asynchronous, like through my computer, you know, so, you know.
Yeah, I guess this question also, I mean, kind of reminds me of something I mentioned earlier when I sort of, in the very beginning, when I mentioned, you know, we had this category of essential worker that everyone was talking about. And I think along with that, there was sort of, we were more intimately familiar with or aware of and thinking about the kind of supply chains and like modes of circulation of goods and services, because we were constantly thinking about what thing are we touching, and who's touched it before me, and this kind of thing, and who's being deemed you know, essential or not. So there's that. So that had an effect of sort of building interconnectedness, to a sense of it, despite the isolation. And I also thought about interconnectedness, sort of going back to the discussion of you know, the lung, the collective lung, and the breath. You know, I thought a lot about that in the context of the wildfire smoke that's come up, and particularly because, and I write about this in one of a few short pieces at the end of the publication that are sort of themed around the mutual air device at Lake Merritt. But yeah, but basically I was outside, probably foolishly, on the notorious Orange Day, and I was just sort of, you know, marveling at this in a sort of you know, frightening way, and it reminded me of and it ended up reminding me of interconnectedness, because it reminded me of the relationship between you know, town and country, or cities and rural areas. And I started thinking about, you know, how the responsibility of PG&E for kind of the vast majority of epic, you know, wildfires in Northern California in recent years. And I thought about, you know, the power lines sort of coursing through the Chaparral and the Sierra Nevadas that led to that. And it sort of reminded me of really the, you know, exploitative relationship between cities and rural areas, where it's really, you know, the concentration of power here in the form of electricity that, you know, ends up kind of ravaging, you know, the landscape and rural areas. So this is all to say, yeah, in the midst of all of the isolation, you know, there were new forms of interconnectedness kind of showing themselves. And I think that's kind of a thread throughout the piece. Cool. Well, the other question that's come through the audience function is, it says, great discussion and work. I'd love to hear thoughts on the swell of slick, quote, social justice graffiti that popped up in downtown Oakland post uprisings. Is this the article Plywood and Paint, they say. And so I can say a little bit about that. I wrote that piece. Yes, that's the piece it's referring to. Yeah, basically, you know, I think that the sort of much celebrated kind of groundswell of murals, kind of ostensibly and directly, you know, related to the uprising this past summer, were not as sort of grassroots as we're led to believe, right? So in this piece, I describe the way that you know, downtown property owners and merchants actually had a lot of sort of say and power in, you know, what messages were being sort of enshrined on these walls. And I look at basically how I call it sort of in a form of art washing, the groundswell of public art, like obscured some of the more militant and irreverent, messaging of anonymous rioters. But I also think that, Oakland landlords, merchants, city officials, nonprofit organizations used like the plywood and paint itself, like in a process that's largely kind of independent of what the murals say. They use the plywood and paint to kind of protect and reproduce, policing and property interests on a local level, because they discouraged us from, making the connections between police violence and gentrification on a local level, right? So that's kind of all I'll say there. Let's see, what else we got going?
I wonder if I can make a comment on that and connect it back to, I think, some other stuff one of the through lines that I saw. Like, I feel like this kind of the art washing question here sort of brings us to, I think, in a way, potentially back to one of the concerns around like the value of like the momentary or engaging with the moment, and rather than like fixating on creating, a permanent institution. And I think, in kind of maybe Dio's terminology, like we kind of deal with the question of commercialization as like a transition point away from the kind of, more cobbled together immediacy. And I think, that somehow surveillance kind of ends up connected in all of this, like the kind of the presumably, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear where the kind of the notion of putting up these murals kind of came from, but you have to think that at some level it comes from police observing like just how much property destruction was happening and how much vandalism was happening, and trying to find a way to co-opt that. I think, and then, maybe at the more abstract level, one of the concepts that, your piece, Alex, opens with this question of like the front loop and the back loop, where the front loop is sort of, as far as I can tell, it's sort of in a way, or like, I guess the back loop is the kind of more, rupture moment, the kind of moment of innovation and transformation. And the front loop is kind of this moment of like reincorporation. So I guess, kind of at large, we're dealing with like a whole variety of these cycles of, what might be insurgency and counterinsurgency, or, kind of free creation and commercialization. I'm just wondering whether other folks have, I don't know, thoughts in that space.
Well, one thing that kind of reminds me of, and this is kind of looking forward a little bit, but, obviously like public space is under attack in innumerable ways. And I think that's kind of taken interesting forms this past year, particularly with the sort of what we used to call parklets, but are now just like, I guess, the outdoors, out in the street in front of like every other restaurant or whatever. But I'm definitely interested in the way that, the sort of businesses being able to, expand into what we would generally consider public space, the way that's going to be sort of enshrined moving forward. Like to what extent is that going to be made kind of permanent or semi-permanent, or to what extent is the normalizing of the notion of a business having control over the street in front of their business, like to what extent is that going to kind of carry forward? And I think that's a really relevant question for downtown. And a thing that to my mind kind of preceded that issue would be actually on 13th Street, the parklet down there, which was a project of the Business Improvement District, representing area landlords and developers. So that's what comes up around that for me.
Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of nest of questions, Julian. But it does call to mind a line in your piece, Sam. Sorry, I'm undoubtedly misquoting it, but you mentioned how social media handles were included on either the reserved swatches of plywood, where the murals came to be painted, and how that misdirected or redirected the pedestrians' gaze from like the world around them, like to like a site of future capital or like a site of future enrichment. So I thought that was a really interesting turn in just thinking about how space over determines, or how spatial relationships over determine how value is perceived, or how value is constructed rather. And I think that definitely became very pertinent in the space of the protests, where people were not looking, or were being told to not look at the street where the actual conversation was happening. And then, yeah, deferring to these nonprofits, or more liberal institutions. So yeah, I thought that was really, really great. Kind of a psychogeographic turn.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, I just remember like after the kind of initial wave of really intense street demonstrations, you know, walking around downtown the next day and looking at basically the riot graffiti. And I was like, you know, I was sort of amused and taken by like the irreverent tone of some of it, but I was really interested in the riot graffiti that was really specific, you know, that named something about the business upon whose like storefront it landed. And I think that kind of pointed to, you know, the possibilities of like a more oppositional public art practice, you know, one that kind of like marks its opponents and actually like reveals the like, you know, contested terrain of civic life. And I think that's largely what you lose with the sort of replacement of that kind of graffiti with a lot of the sanctioned murals. Especially, yeah, it was like, I don't know, I remember walking around and I felt like I was being led by the riot graffiti through the city in a way that I hadn't been before. You know, it's going from one piece to the next. And that got me thinking, you know, and at the end of the murals piece, I try to sort of, you know, call for more of a practice along these lines. But I was like, yeah, what about, you know, graffiti that like names like a slumlord here and like recruits you to like a tenant union like on the block after that, and that kind of thing. So really it's just a call for sort of a more specific like contextual public art practice. And I think some of the riot graffiti kind of pointed the way for that. Yeah.
Yeah, going off that, I was thinking about there are a lot of images that people have taken of the like recombobulated murals in downtown Oakland, and looking at a lot of those images up close, it's just like so stark the way the sort of transparent way in which those images themselves are almost attempting to glitch reality, like they're attempting to take a bunch of context and like flip it on itself and sort of do away with a lot of the questions that people are posing, you know, either in the form of rioting and leaving graffiti behind as like a marker of something that has occurred, or people who are coming in afterward and having these conversations with businesses and nonprofits, and sort of negotiating to have access to that space. It just feels like a very transparent move of a sort of subverting not the individual meanings of the different instances of graffiti, but the meaning of there being graffiti present at all on a space. And that subversion, to me, again, is just like, it's really transparent. Like it follows with the motives of capital and of gentrification that we all already know and see all the time. And so those images are really like stark to me. They tell a really fascinating story.
Cool. All right. I think maybe we're hitting our time or thereabouts. Yeah. Cool. I think maybe we can, hey Dina, are you back?
I'm back.
Cool.
That was phenomenal. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Dina, and thanks everyone here. I don't know if I can I send a link to get the publication to the chat before we go? Can I do that?
Absolutely. I did previously, but we should put it in again.
Cool.
I'm just going to pop it in because I already have it copied here. But yes, please pre-order because I think they're on limited run, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. How many copies are being released?
We're aiming for 300 copies, so there will be about 300 copies.
Yeah, that's not much. Pre-order your copy today, y'all. This is so, I mean, it's an incredible inspiration to me to see how your minds work and work together and how everything seems to bleed together in this ecosystem of Oakland. And I felt that in the streets. I felt that randomly on Zoom, even though in a less tactile manner. But the mutual aid obviously is palpable. And so thank you all for your work. And thank you to Sam for arranging all this, organizing the publication. It's been extraordinary. Any last words?
Thank you, Dina and Sam, and thanks to Alex and Tara and Julian. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Really appreciate everybody attending and all of your thoughts and work. It's been really great.
Thank you.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you. I really enjoyed hearing everyone's thoughts. And yeah, just really appreciated getting to read all of your pieces and being a part of this. So thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Yes. Thank you, everybody. Okay. I guess we can go then. I don't know how do you end these things, Dina?
I'll end it here.
All right.
Okay, bye. Bye, everyone.
Everyone.